Well, welcome back. In this unit, we're going to be focused on Chapter 4 of Harmer, which is on describing learning and teaching. So you should have read Chapter 4 before watching this lecture, and if you haven't had a chance to do that, just go ahead and stop the video now and take some time to read and come on back to us. So when we think about teaching a second language, it can be helpful to think first about how children acquire their first language. Almost all children acquire a first language, their mother tongue, without any effort. This is universally true around the world. It is virtually guaranteed until about the age of 6. It becomes less apparent that children can acquire language as they approach puberty if they haven't up until that point. But in general, it is a total universal that without effort, children acquire language. That language emerges first as phonemes, individual sounds, then word utterances, ba, ba, ma, ma, phrases, so maybe mommy shoe, daddy go, and then simple sentences and moving on to more complex sentences. What two things need to be in place for acquisition of the first language to happen? Think about that for a second. The first thing that needs to be in place is exposure. So infants and children need to hear lots of language. They need to be exposed to being spoken to and hearing language just being spoken around them. And what kind of language do children typically often hear? Think about how we talk to babies and kids. Well, it's usually something that's known as infant-directed speech or motherese, or sometimes we might talk about it as rough tuning. So it's marked by this exaggeration of intonation, less complex sentences, less technical vocabulary. This also is almost universal, that people talk to babies and young children with that higher pitch. How are you? Where's your ball? And we do this because babies and toddlers respond to it. There's research that indicates that babies respond to that higher pitch and that exaggerated intonation much more than just being talked to in a sort of flat tone like I'm talking now. What are the contexts in which children hear language? Well, typically this is going to be in social and emotional interaction. So they're hearing languages in the way that it's typically used. They're learning what language is appropriate when in situations that they are observing and that they are involved in. And what's a child's motivation to acquire language? Well, children have a strong motivational urge to be fed, to be understood. Their survival relies on others taking care of them, and so they are very motivated to communicate with their caregivers. How do children try out language? Well, they repeat things that they hear, they talk to themselves. Maybe when laying in their crib, you will hear them babbling to themselves, trying out language, playing with words. When children are trying out language, we may hear forms come out of them that are different than what we would expect, and those might actually give us pause if we didn't know any better. So you might hear a child say something like, "Mommy drived me to school today," or "I slept so well," and they are applying rules that they're hearing. They're hearing that if something happened in the past, we add that ed ending to it, but they're over applying it to situations where the irregular past tense would be expected, but they're trying it out, and we know that eventually they'll make their way to the correct forms. So if we know that children acquire language subconsciously with just exposure to language, with motivation to communicate, and with opportunities to use it, what does this tell us about how students should learn a second language? Think about that for a moment. If we know these things about first language acquisition, what are the implications for us teaching a second language? Can we or should we try to replicate the first language acquisition in the language classroom? Well, the applied linguist Stephen Krashen in the 1980s said that there is a distinction between acquisition of language and learning of language, that we should make this distinction because it's important. Acquisition is subconscious. It happens without us thinking about it or trying, and it involves no anxiety. Learning, on the other hand, is a conscious activity. We learn separate language items that we study and we practice. And he said that language that is learned consciously requires the learner to think consciously about what they want to say, which can cause anxiety and which can get in the way of just the message that we want to communicate. So Krashen would say that the role of a language teacher should be to provide the right kind of language exposure, just exposure, to comprehensible input, or what he called the I+1. So this is basically language that's just above, that is what students can understand, but if it's just above their own language of production, what they're able to say. It causes us to have to ask this question, that if we assume that comprehensible input is important, how should we proceed in the classroom? Well, what we can say for sure is that we shouldn't only focus on how the language works, but would there be a problem with a pure exposure approach? Think about that for a moment. Is there a problem with the idea that we would just give students as much exposure as possible to language and eventually they'll just acquire it? Well, some problems with a pure exposure approach might be that, first, there's some evidence that the ability to acquire language deteriorates with age. So adults and adolescents may overthink or not suck up language like a sponge in the same way that toddlers seem to do. Also, teens and adults already know their L1 well, and they sometimes can benefit from learning the how, the what, the why of the L2. Some of them may be very interested in thinking consciously about how the new language works and comparing it based on what they already know about their first language. Another important consideration is that depending on how much time is available for class for all of that input and exposure alone may be insufficient. And that's probably especially true when we think about our adult classes. The students might be coming for, a few hours a week to the language classroom, and that's really never going to be enough exposure for acquisition, just purely based on input to happen. So it seems like a balanced approach to learning and acquisition is going to be important. So we would say that a rich classroom environment is going to be one where students are exposed to the language, where they are provided opportunities to activate their language knowledge, and opportunities to study the language, that all of those things are going to be important. The acquisition and learning debate isn't the only trend in thinking about teaching principles and methods in language. You likely studied many of these methods and approaches in TESOL 341, or you will do when you take that class. Here on the slide is a timeline of a brief history of ESL methods and approaches over about the last 200 years. And we're going to be talking about a number of these briefly today. And then you're going to be watching some demonstrations of about 4 of them for your video answer Unit 4. But if you want to look at this timeline a little bit more in depth, go ahead and pause the video and have a look at that. So the first of those methods we're going to look at was the grammar translation method. The basic idea with GTM was to present students with grammar rules and lists of vocabulary words. And they would need to memorize these rules and this vocabulary and then translate literature, typically from their first language into the second language, or from the second language back into the first. The focus was really on being able to translate, and the focus was also on reading and writing, not much at all on listening and speaking. This method is really still alive and well in a lot of English as a foreign language context. This is definitely the dominant method. This may even be similar to the way you learned a foreign language in high school, doing a lot of verb conjugation charts and memorization of vocabulary lists, and then translating as part of your activities and assessments. Could a complete reliance on grammar translation hinder students? Well, it certainly could in the way that the GTM really teaches people about language, but it doesn't give them much of an ability to communicate with that language. They're not going to be getting the natural language input that's going to help them acquire language. And because they're always looking at the L1, looking for L1 equivalents of the L2, they may find that there aren't equivalents exactly between L1 and L2 at all times. There's really not a lot of opportunities to activate this language knowledge in the GTM. The next important wave was the direct method. And although your textbook doesn't mention this one, it was important because it reacted against the GTM. And instead, it sought to try to mimic some of the aspects of first language acquisition by really immersing the learner in language of the L2. So whereas GTM classes might be conducted in the first language, in the direct method, classes would only be conducted in the target language, the second language. Grammar was not taught deductively. You would not be taught rules and then expected to apply them, but rather you would be exposed to plenty of examples of language, and from there you would inductively determine the grammar rules yourself. Similarly to how, infants and toddlers are not taught grammar lessons, but just like we saw in that example of the baby saying, "I slept so well," they had heard enough examples of that ed ending and then applied it to a past tense situation that they wanted to communicate. It would be similar in the direct method, that they would learn inductively how to apply those rules. And also the direct method had a much greater focus on speaking and listening rather than reading and writing. The next method we would see then would be audiolingualism. And in ALM, the teacher would use the grammatical patterns of English and do a lot of students repeating phrases in those patterns in order to learn them. So it was really based in behaviorist theory. So Skinner and the Behaviorist School of Psychology said that what we should do if we want to reinforce desired behaviors is give positive responses to those desired behaviors. And to undesired behaviors, we give no response or a negative response. And eventually we reinforce the positive behaviors or the desired behaviors, and we don't reinforce or we eliminate the undesired behaviors. So ALM tried to apply this concept to language learning. So you would do lots of repetition and drills of simple phrases, and thereby develop habits around using those forms. You would start with simple forms. So I go to the store, we go to the store, you go to the store. Maybe that first subject is the slot, and we replace that with I, we, you, and we reinforce that for all of those, go would be the verb that we would use. I go to the store, you go to the store, we go to the store. There would be a lot of cue response drills, so a lot of repeat after me that the teacher would lead and the students would follow in a chain. It began to lose popularity essentially because of this. There was the criticism that language learning is really a lot more subtle than just the formation of habits and repeating learned phrases. It was found that students were often able to repeat those learned phrases, but really not able to produce natural language, novel utterances of things they wanted to communicate. There are still elements of the audiolingual method that can be seen in the method known as presentation practice production, or PPP. And in this method, the teacher first presents meaning and context of a language form. So for example, maybe you're teaching about future aspect, and the topic would be plans for the summer. And then you would do some controlled practice using that form. So we will go to the beach this summer. We will sit on the sand, and we will play in the water. So it may look similar to those drills that we would have seen in ALM. But then after they've done some controlled practice, they're able to have some time to use the form in novel communication, in production. So still using that form of future aspect, now they can choose what they would like to say. So maybe it's, I will go to the store on Saturday. I will buy some bananas. Giving them opportunity to produce in a way that involves communicating a message of their own choosing. This can also be used for pronunciation. So first, maybe introducing a particular phoneme, doing some controlled practice with words that contain that phoneme, and then giving students an opportunity to think of other words they know that involve that phoneme. So that would be the presentation, practice, production. And this is still used widely today, although it often is integrated into one of many approaches rather than being a method that sort of stands alone. Next, total physical response sort of took off in the late 60s through the early 80s. And in TPR, it's a method of teaching language or vocabulary concepts by using physical movement to react to verbal input, typically commands. So the teacher gives commands, stand up, sit down, walk to the board, etc. And she acts them out as she is saying them. And then she repeats the commands and has the students do the acting out while she gives those commands. And then later, there's the students who can give the commands while the other students and even the teacher will act them out. So it's really a method that's best understood by watching it. And one of the videos today is going to be on TPR. But the idea is that it reduces student inhibitions and lowers their stress because it's fun, it's using their bodies, and they're not required to speak until they're ready, until they decide. It also was built around the idea that when you're physically engaged in kinesthetic movement, while exploring new language, it creates a brain link between the speech and the physical action that can boost our language and vocabulary learning. Next, there's something called the silent way, in which teachers really do very little talking, and the onus is on the students. And this is one that is really just best going to be understood by watching the video. So that's one of the 4 you're going to look at today. But I'll spend a little time on communicative language teaching, or CLT, and this is certainly the most dominant theory today. And it's based on 2 principles. The first is that language involves language functions. So we want to learn to use language to do things with language. So that could be greeting, inviting, suggesting, disagreeing, etc. And students should learn how to use language by using these different language exponents. So the idea that there are different ways of using language to accomplish the same function. So the example given in the textbook was, would you like to come to the movies? Interested in a movie? What do you think of a movie? These are all different ways to say the same thing, but there's an appropriate way to say what you want to communicate given the context and given the audience. And communicative language teaching really took both those things into account. And then the second principle is that if students get enough exposure to language and chances to use language, and if motivation is present, there will be success. And so we can really see the influence of first language acquisition on CLT. And I think the greatest strength of CLT is its emphasis on learning language, not just so that we can know about language, but really so that we can use it to communicate. A natural extension of CLT was task-based learning. TBL focuses on the use of authentic language and on asking students to do meaningful tasks using the target language. Tasks could involve things like going to the doctor, conducting an interview, calling customer service for help, any number of tasks from simple to complex, but the focus is on the task rather than on the language. It usually follows a sequence, so the first thing would be the pre-task, where students are introduced to the idea of the task, what they're going to need to do, what are some of the considerations they'll need to be thinking about. Next is the task cycle. So students plan the task, they gather the language and the information they'll need to do the task, and then they produce. They come up with some written or oral activity that they would do to complete the task. And finally, there would be the language focus part of the sequence, where students then analyze the language that they used. They can make improvements on things that they had said or written and make repairs where those are needed. And in a sense, this kind of flips PPP on its head, because you start with production as the starting point rather than the end point, and then go back to presentation and practice. Well, the last section I'm going to discuss in this lecture is what Harmer calls the elements of successful language learning. We've talked about some of the methodological trends in language teaching over the past 2 centuries, but nowadays most people take an eclectic approach. This is one in which we look at all of the best elements of a variety of teaching approaches, and we come up with the best strategies and approach that fit us as instructors. And this has become the most popular way to do it, because in each of the methods that we have looked at today, there are some things that are valuable and useful, and other things that we could probably do without. Even if some of these methods seem strange or silly, there could be a kernel of something useful in each one of them. But is there any danger in being an eclectic instructor? Well, the danger may be that if you have a sort of anything goes approach, you may go too far and not really think very critically about what you're including. There may be no real coherence to the activities and the materials that you use with your students if you're used to sort of just picking and choosing at random. But Harmer would argue that there's something called principled eclecticism that really does have an underlying philosophy and structure, such as that students need exposure, motivation, and opportunity to use language in order to learn language. And with that philosophy underlying it, we use that principle to choose from a variety of approaches. And Harmer says that most teaching sequences really need these 3 certain elements of engage, study, and activate. The first element, engage, is the idea that we learn better when both our minds and our hearts are in it. So this usually involves activating their schema or their background knowledge. It can involve discussions, dramatic stories, anecdotes, relating school materials to home, asking for predictions. If students are engaged from the outset, their involvement in the next 2 elements is definitely going to be more pronounced. The next element is study. And this is when the students are asked to focus on the construction of language. It could be on the language itself, it can be on the way it's used, or on how it sounds, how it looks. It can involve phonology or syntax, like I say, how it sounds, how it looks, how words work with words. It may involve cues, so we may want them to think about the best way to say a word or the best word for what we mean. And we cue them to produce those. It could involve discovery activities where we show students examples of language and we ask them to work out the rules. They do the intellectual work, that kind of implicit or inductive learning. And the third element is activate, where we get students to use the language as freely as possible, not to use a particular structure that we've given them. So this element describes activities and exercises where we encourage them to use language communicatively. We don't want to give them a particular structure or a list of words that they should use. We want to just give them free rein to focus on the message they're trying to convey. Use any and all language they have for that situation or topic. It could involve personalization, which is when students create something like their own dialogues or a debate or a role play. This is personalization is kind of like a bridge between the study and activate stages, or like the production stage in PPP, where they can use the same structures and vocabulary from the practice phase in a way where they have more choice in the topics or content. Does activation only refer to speaking? Well, no, not actually. Activation can be reading or listening for pleasure. It could be even an internet search, some kind of extended writing activity, even making a phone call. The focus in an activation phase is on the message rather than on the forms of language that the students are seeing and hearing. Later, they can go back to what they've heard or read or said and focus on the construction, on the forms. But in activation, it actually can come before study, and we're going to see that there are different sequences in which we can use ESA. So all three elements of ESA should be present in lesson sequences, not necessarily in a single day of class, but in the sequence of lessons of, say, a unit. But they don't always need to occur in the same order. So a few possibilities. The first one is the straight arrow sequence, where we see engage, study, activate. There's an example on page 54 of the textbook about using a robot to work on the construction of can and can't. So in the engage part of the sequence, students are shown a picture or a website or a video of new generation robots, and they talk a bit about robots. Then they move on to study, where the grammar and the pronunciation construction of can and can't are presented, and the students talk about what the robot can and can't do. And finally, they move on to activate, where students work in groups to design and describe their dream robot. And then they make a presentation talking about what the robot can and can't do. So this is a lot like PPP, and it's good for lower levels, and it's good for language that is pretty straightforward. Another potential sequence would be the boomerang sequence, which is sometimes also called teach, test, teach. Where you start with engage, but then go to activate, back to study, and then activate again. So the example that's given on page 55 of the text, the students start by engaging in a discussion about job interviews, what might be talked about at a job interview, questions that they might have to answer. And then they go into activate, where students create a role play of a job interview, where they're not focusing on construction, but really just focusing on the message, on meaning. And while they're doing that, the teacher makes note of difficulties or errors that they're making. Then they go into study, and the teacher goes over any problematic grammar or vocabulary. Perhaps they have to discover where they went wrong. And maybe they do some controlled practice with the correct forms. Then later, they go into activate again, and the students role play another job interview, and this time they're integrating what they have learned in the study part of the sequence. So that is going to look a lot like task-based learning procedures. A third potential sequence with ESA is the patchwork approach. So sometimes you're going to find that those three elements are going to be mixed in a variety of procedures and in mini procedures that all kind of build up to the whole of the lesson. And this is especially the case when you use one lesson to cover a few different constructions. I'm going to let you go ahead and look at the example that's given on page 56 yourself, but it could look something like engage, activate, activate again, study, activate, study, engage, activate, and you're kind of going back and forth and all around. But this is actually very common, especially at the intermediate and advanced levels. So the example on page 56 involved doing both some vocabulary work and some work with relative clause construction, which is a fairly advanced grammatical form. And for activities that are complex like that, and for those more intermediate and advanced levels, taking this patchwork approach really makes a lot of sense. We'll look more at how you can balance those 3 ESA elements in lesson planning when we get to chapter 12. But for today, go ahead and have a look at the task list for the details and all activities for day 4, and enjoy those, and I will see you back next time.